Hey everyone, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through an activity that I do with my students approximately a week before the exam. I have my students come up with a game plan for the exam, that way they can play to their strengths and hopefully maximize their score. In this video, I'm going to show you that process. Let's start by talking about the multiple choice section. For this section of the exam, you will have 1 hour to answer 45 questions. There are technically two types of questions on the multiple choice section. The first two passages are the reading comprehension questions. These passages are a bit longer and they have more questions compared to the writing questions. There's also the second portion of the test, which has three passages. Those are the writing questions. Those are less about comprehension and more about editing. They ask you about transitions and combining sentences, and also whether or not sentences should be added or rearranged. So, for the multiple choice section in general, you want to think about your pacing. If you've done a full length practice exam, how was your pacing? Did it take you the entire hour? Did you have a little bit of time left? Or were you scrambling to bubble in letters at the very end because time was about to be called? You also want to look at your accuracy. This is especially important for students who might struggle with pacing. They might really struggle to answer all the questions in 1 hour, but the questions that they do answer might be very accurate. You also want to look for, is there a certain type of question that you miss regularly? When it gets close to the exam, if I have a student who misses a certain type of question regularly, I tell them to make sure that they don't over focus on that question on the exam. I'm not trying to be harsh in any way, but if you tend to miss a certain type of question, don't waste your time on it on exam day. Instead, focus on the questions you are much more likely to get right. Now, I'm not saying don't try on those questions. Just don't lose track of time trying to get the right answer. Give it your best guess and move on. Something else to consider is, are you stronger at the writing questions, the reading questions, or is it the same? For my students, I've seen all of these in any given class. I have some students who do equally well on both sections. For them, they tend to like to take the test in order. I have some students that are stronger at the reading questions, so they too like to take the test in order. However, over the past couple years, I've had multiple students that were noticeably stronger with the writing questions. Their accuracy was much better and they felt more comfortable with that type of question. Knowing this, one of the things that we did as an experiment was I gave them a full length test and I had them start at the writing questions to see if it would improve their score. So they did the writing questions and they had more time to spend on that. And then they went back to the reading questions, which they struggled with. And they did the best they could. And if they ran out of time, they just gave it an educated guess. For most, if not all of those students, it did improve their score by a couple points to do it that way. Because when they took the test in order, they were rushing through the writing questions, which were the ones that they were good at. So I'm not suggesting that everybody should start with the writing questions on exam day, but I am suggesting that you should try to get your hands on a practice test, either from your teacher or there is a really good one from Marco Learning that's free. Give yourself 1 hour and experiment with the process. Figure out if you like to answer the questions in order or if perhaps you have a different test taking strategy. One thing to keep in mind though is that you absolutely need to make sure that you are bubbling in the answer for the correct question. When students take the test out of order, there is an increased margin of error if you don't match up the question you're answering to the correct bubble set. So that's just something to keep in mind. As I tell my students, the AP test in some sense is like a game. You have a timer, you have a task, and your job is to get the highest score possible. Each multiple choice question is essentially worth 1 point because there are 45 questions, and the multiple choice is 45% of your composite. For those for whom multiple choice is a strength, use this to your advantage. Build what I call a cushion. That means try to get as many right as possible. That way, in case you have an essay that you struggle with, your multiple choice score will help your composite. Now, if you're the opposite and multiple choice happens to be your weakness, you're still trying to get the highest number correct you can, but you might be more strategic with how you go about doing that. Now let's talk about the essays. For the essays, you have 2 hours and 15 minutes total. What students sometimes don't realize though is that even though the College Board gives you recommendations as far as how long to spend on each section of the writing portion, you can actually budget your time however you see fit. The College Board recommends 15 minutes for reading time and 40 minutes per essay. And honestly, I've seen that timing breakdown work well for many students. However, I have other students who, after answering some of these questions, realize that they might want to budget their time a little bit differently. So, the first thing you want to consider is how long does it typically take you to read and annotate the synthesis sources? I time my students in class throughout the year as we do synthesis essays. At the beginning of the year, we start with about 17 minutes. Then we go down to 15, and then we try 12 and even 10. It's just a practice, and for some students, they can actually read and annotate quite well in 10 minutes. Other students, once they hit that 10-minute mark, they're not quite done. So those students know, hey, I need a little bit more time than 10 minutes on exam day. It's not about rushing, it's about figuring out how much time you need in order to complete the task successfully to set yourself up for writing the best possible essay. You also want to consider how long, on average, it takes you to write a synthesis essay. Do you do it well in 40 minutes? If you spent 35 minutes on the essay, would you get the same score? If you spent 45 minutes on the essay, would you go up a point on the rubric? These are all things to consider. And yes, sometimes it really does depend on the passage, but it's still good to know what your limitations are. You also want to consider rhetorical analysis. How long does it take you to read and annotate for rhetorical analysis? Earlier this year, I did a mock exam essay with my students, and for rhetorical analysis, it took me between 5 and 10 minutes to read and annotate. And even though that meant I had less time to actually write the essay, I felt like I had written a better essay because I was able to plan accordingly. I was able to be very thorough with my annotations, and I made a very simple outline that helped me stay on task. So, in addition to knowing approximately how long it would take you to read and annotate, you also want to consider how long does it take you to write an effective rhetorical analysis essay. If this essay happens to be your strong suit, then you might decide you want to spend 45 minutes on the essay. Now, given that there's a concrete amount of time total, that means that those extra 5 minutes have to come from somewhere. So, is it coming from your reading time, or perhaps is it that you can write an argument essay in less time? So you want to consider how long it takes you to write an argument essay. I have some students that, quite honestly, they could spend 30 to 35 minutes on their argument essay and they would earn the 4 out of 6. Whereas if they spent 40 minutes on the essay, honestly, their score would still be a 4 out of 6. For those students, as long as they know they've secured the score that they want for that particular essay, it might benefit them to free up some time for the other essays where perhaps they're stronger. So that's definitely something to consider for yourself. Which essay type are you best at, and which essay type do you struggle with the most? For some students, you might be equally good at all of them, in which case, then it might come down to the prompt you're actually given on exam day. You might connect better with certain prompts and decide, yes, I want to spend more time on this because I have insight that will help my score. And this is why I call it a game plan, because honestly, the game plan can vary from student to student. When I did this last year with my students, something else I had them think about was, do you intend to write the essays in the order in which they appear? Because technically, you don't have to start with synthesis if you don't want to. Now, last year, all of my students agreed that they did, in fact, want to start with synthesis because it's the most time consuming and involved, and they wanted to get it out of the way. Most of my students then wanted to move on to rhetorical analysis and finish with argument because a lot of them felt like argument was going to be their weakest potential essay. So they knew exactly what they needed to do to hit the score that they wanted, but they really wanted to give themselves more time on the other two essays to work toward a higher score. However, I did have a few students who actually liked the argument essay type better, and they felt like rhetorical analysis was their weak spot. So they did their exam essays in the order of synthesis, argument, and rhetorical analysis. On exam day, you're going to be writing your essays in an exam booklet, and there's a little spot at the top of your paper to indicate which question you're answering. Plus, all the prompts are very different, so the people reading your exam will know which essay you're talking about. So if, for instance, going in a different order than synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument might help your score, consider the order in which you write your essays. Also, one question that students have asked me recently is, can I leave some space and then go back to the essay? What if I decide I want to move on because of my time constraints, but then I actually get ahead of myself and I have more time? Can I go back to my essay? The answer is yes, because all the essays are in the same booklet. So I would encourage you to leave a little bit of space if you think you're going to go back to that essay, just in case you want the time to do so. Now that we've looked at all of those previous questions, Here's an example of how you might use those answers to create a game plan. Now, this is just a sample. This is honestly how I would spend my time based on my strengths as a writer, but that doesn't mean that this approach will work for everyone. So, in a second, I'm going to tell you how to create your own game plan. You'll notice that on the slide here, it says, be sure to use all your time. Regardless of what your game plan is, you need to understand that on exam day, you're going to be under pressure. And so certain tasks might take longer than you thought. So it's important that your game plan is a bit flexible. It's also important to understand the rubric for each of the essays. I recommend that students strive for at least a 4 out of 6. And knowing what that could look like means that not all students need to write a 4 or 5 paragraph essay. For instance, conclusions are not necessary. They can be helpful, but if you know that you've achieved the score that you want with your body paragraphs and you feel like you're running out of time, maybe leave some space for a conclusion in case you want to come back to it, but maybe move on to the next essay. That way, you have time to make sure you're earning the points you want for that essay as well. So, not only do you have to be a little bit fluid on exam day, which is why doing a mock exam before the test can really help, but also you want to use all of your time because let's face it, 40 minutes on average per essay is not that much time, even though the essays are viewed as rough drafts. And I personally believe that was something as important as an AP test because I know for a lot of students, it's an opportunity to potentially earn college credit. You don't want to leave time unfulfilled. There's always a chance that you could go back and add more content that would be valuable, or at the very least, you could proofread and go look at your word choice to see if you can improve the quality of your words or your sentence structure. So if you find that you have 5 or even 10 minutes left on exam day, don't just sit there, don't put your head down. Exam day is game day. Exam day is the day that you can get those results. So don't leave time unattended. Make sure that you're actively working the entire time. Here's a quick way to create your own game plan. Now, you might decide that you want to be more thorough than this, and that's absolutely fine. You also might want to create a best case and worst case scenario. I sometimes have my students do this as well, because as I mentioned, students might need to be a bit more fluid on exam day. Your game plan might change depending on the prompt or other factors. So you want to have those two different scenarios in the back of your head. That way you can adjust accordingly. So ask yourself, are you going to answer the questions in order or are you going to start with writing first? Again, this is a personal preference. I'm not advocating for either method. Try to figure out approximately how many minutes you might want to spend on the reading versus the writing. Even though it's approximately half the test for each, I find that students spend more time on the reading questions. For my students, on average, they spend 35 minutes on reading and 25 on writing. But again, that's an average. There are definitely exceptions to that. Also, figure out which essay you might want to start with and figure out how much reading and planning time you need for that essay, as well as how much writing time. And of course, repeat this for the other 2 essays as well. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And also, I would love it if you would share it with some of your friends that are taking AP Lang. Also, don't forget to make sure that you are subscribed to this channel because as the AP Lang exam approaches, I'm going to be going live on both YouTube and TikTok to offer students different tips for exam day and to answer questions that students might have. To be informed about those, make sure that you click that little bell to receive notifications. And like I said, I'll be on TikTok as well. So if you are a TikTok user, please search Coach Hall Writes on TikTok. I would love to see you over there as well. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy writing.